In late 1837, a ripple of panic began to spread around Clapham in South London. Something terrible was lurking out of the fog and attacking local residents. An elderly lady visiting the cemetery at Clapham was one of the first to see the chilling figure. Clad in a dark cloak, the hat pulled over its face, she saw it make an ungodly jump over a high fence and disappear into the darkness. Around the same time, a young girl by the name of Mary Stevens reported an encounter with the same strange character. Making a giant leap out of a dark alley, it launched a fearsome attack on the girl, ripping at her clothes with its cold, clammy claws. The girl screamed for help, and the creature fled. The next night, a similar figure jumped out at a coach, causing it to crash. Several witnesses saw the figure escape the scene by bounding over a 9-foot-high wall, its high-pitched laughter disappearing into the distance. The creature was more beast-like in the earlier accounts. Soon, news of the attacks would reach the authorities. Sir John Cowan, the Lord Mayor, received an anonymous letter alerting him to the spate of attacks. Cowan initially dismissed the letter as wild nonsense. However, within weeks he was flooded with similar accounts of attacks all across London and was forced to call a public meeting to discuss the crime rate. News had also started to reach the flourishing tabloid press. While early accounts varied wildly, it was here that Jack's appearance and modus operandi became fixed, and his famous name, Spring Hill Jack, was born. According to the papers, Jack had pointed ears and a hooked nose, fierce claws, and glowing red eyes. Beneath the dark cloak, he wore a tight oilskin suit, always present with his miraculous ability to jump great heights. By the 1830s, taxation on paper and printing had been greatly reduced, leading to a boom of cheap, popular printed media, newspapers, and a kind of early graphic novel called The Penny Dreadful. These publications were hungry for lurid tales of crime and horror, and the stories of Spring Hill Jack immediately caught their attention. It was in the Penny Dreadfuls that Jack became a kind of early Victorian supervillain, his abilities and appearance massively exaggerated. Now his leaps were over entire buildings, sometimes he could even fly, and his eyes glowing red, and he could even spit blue fire from his mouth. Meanwhile, the real Spring Hill Jack was about to make his most famous and well-documented attack. In a well-to-do home in London's East End in February of 1838, teenager Jane Alsop answered the door to be greeted by a shadowy figure. "I'm a policeman, for God's sake, bring me a light, for we have caught Spring Hill Jack here in the lane." Fetching the man a candle, Jane was startled by his strange appearance. Suddenly, he flung off his cloak and started to attack the girl. His eyes glowed red, and he spewed blue flames as he clawed at the girl's clothes with his metal talons. With the help of her sister, the girl eventually managed to free herself from Jack's grasp and retreated to the safety of the house. Whether Jane had exaggerated the outlandish aspects of Jack's appearance, perhaps influenced by the press accounts, is lost to history. But the police and the magistrate treated her report as a real attack. Indeed, despite the seeming supernatural qualities that Jack possessed, John Cowan, the Lord Mayor, and the Metropolitan Police were certain the attacks were committed by a flesh-and-blood man. There had been similar sightings in the weeks before the Alsop case, and several culprits were suggested. A bricklayer called Payne was suspected, along with a carpenter called Milbank. However, no positive identifications were made. In January of 1838, barmaid Polly Adams was attacked by a cloaked, devil-like creature that clawed at her on Blackheath. Soon, reports from Ealing, Kensington, and Hammersmith began to pour in, with women frightened into dangerous fits and severely wounded by claws. London's Lord Mayor, Sir John Cowan, received complaints from Peckham residents where 7 ladies had been deprived of their senses and too likely to become burdens on their families. Was this a trend of series of misbegotten pranks or an ongoing wager to scare women? However, Information soon came forward suggesting a much darker plan to kill 6 women within an allotted time. Attacks increased, with people apparently dying of fright in Brixton and Camberwell as hysteria spread. In February, Jack attempted to strangle Jane Alsop outside her home posing as a policeman, while Lucy Scales was attacked in March in Green Dragon Alley. Both described being blinded by blue flames and clawed at before he leaped into the night when disturbed. Now a veritable boogeyman in London, children were being warned that if they misbehaved, Spring Hill Jack would jump through their window. He moved north. One North Hampshire victim claimed that her attacker was the very image of the devil himself, with horns and eyes of flame. Sightings continued throughout the 1850s and 60s in the Midlands, including leaping onto the roof of the Cross Inn in Dudley and disrupting milk pouches in East Anglia. Just a few days after the Alsop case, a similar account was reported by an 18-year-old woman named Lucy Scales. She was out walking with her sister in Limehouse when a figure leaped at her from an alley and blew flames into her face, leaving her in a state of hysterics. The attacker left the scene and was never found, though several men were brought in for questioning. Following the accounts of Jane Alsop and Lucy Scales, Spring Hill Jack sightings were reported all over England and even reaching parts of Scotland. His victims were mostly commonly described as young women, and they all described similar accounts of the mysterious man: thin and tight-fitting clothes and red eyes and claws for hands. One theory going around was that the attacks were committed by a bunch of decadent aristocrats for a wager. The idea that the debauched young aristocracy could be a menace to society was a popular one at the time, especially in the working-class popular press. The individual most often mentioned in the press, especially later in the 19th century, was the 3rd Marquis of Waterford, Henry de la Poer Beresford. Beresford was popularly known as the Mad Marquis for his outrageous drunken pranks and antics. He was also in London at the time of the first assaults. Could he be behind the mysterious attacks of Spring Hill Jack? Aristocrats were first singled out as the culprit in an anonymous letter to the Lord Mayor in 1838. And soon after, the Marquis of Waterford's name was first linked to the case. It's not hard to see why he had become a suspect. He was so notorious in the late 1830s for his drunken vandalism and pranks and outrageous behavior. Many of his hell-raising antics were widely reported in the press, especially the notorious incident at Melton Mowbray that gave rise to the phrase, painting the town red. After a day at the races, Waterford and his fox-hunting friends vandalized the town center with red paint during a drunken rampage. The Marquis, a former boxer, was young and athletic at the time of the sightings and could have easily matched Jack's less outlandish physical exploits. He was also said to have a particularly cruel streak. It didn't seem much of a stretch to suggest that he could also be behind the Spring Hill Jack attacks, perhaps as an idle wager amongst the group. In 1880, E. Cobham Brewer, author of Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable, named Waterford as Jack, although it's unclear as to what he based it on. Brewer wrote that the Marquis used to amuse himself by springing on travelers unawares to frighten them, and from time to time others have followed his silly example. Author Peter Haining wrote the most influential modern account of the Spring Hill Jack phenomenon in 1977. In his book, The Legend and Bizarre Crimes of Spring Hill Jack also named the Marquis of Waterford as the offender. However, the reliability of Haining's evidence has been questioned by some historians. Haining theorized that Marquis had felt humiliated by bad experiences that he had with women and the police. So along with him and his rich companions, they dreamt up the idea of Spring Hill Jack to get revenge. With the help of his friends who had experience in mechanics, Waterford was able to construct special Spring Hill boots to achieve Jack's incredible leaping prowess. According to him, the round-off of the horrifying effect, the Marquis even learnt fire-breathing. One of the reasons the Marquis's name has cropped up as a suspect was the fact that his presence in London coincided with the first Spring Hill Jack assaults. And get this, the Marquis of Waterford lived in the area of the first attacks in 1837 and 1838, and upon his departure from London in 1842, reports of further Jack sightings dried up. Waterford returned to Ireland with his new wife and reportedly turned his back on cruel jokes to live a respectable life until his death in 1859. Intermittent reports of further Spring Hill Jack sightings continued after this. So if Waterford was responsible for the early attacks, then, as Brewer suggested, these later cases were probably copycats. And one further piece of evidence to suggest that the Marquis of Waterford may have been the original Spring Hill Jack was the reported similarity between a crest spotted on Jack's chest with the Waterford's coat of arms. Jack's victims, a young servant boy in a South London household, escaped an encounter with the monster with no more than a fright. He did, however, allegedly observe an elaborate embroidered crest on the assailant's costume, topped with the letter W. Could the W have stood for Waterford? Perhaps the Marquis had appropriated an old piece of family garb, complete with crest, to complete his costume. The main issue with the identification of the Marquis of Waterford as Spring Hill Jack is the lack of verifiable historical evidence to back it up. Like much of the story, fact and fiction have merged into one over the course of countless retellings. By the end of the 19th century, outright fictions about Jack were regularly been reported as historical facts. The Penny Dreadfuls, in particular, would gleefully exaggerate the real attacks and even invent entirely new ones. Many of the supposed supernatural attributes of Jack also originated with these publications. Who was this mysterious fiend who roamed London attacking women? During the 1850s and 60s, Spring Hill Jack was also seen all over England, particularly in the Midlands. The army in 1870 set traps to catch him after scared sentries reported being terrified by a man who sprang onto the roof of their sentry box. Also in 1870, angry townsfolk in Lincoln are reported to have shot at him in the street, but he just laughed and bounded away, leaping over fences and even small buildings. For a while, as no one really had any idea who he was, suspicion rested on the eccentric young Marquis of Waterford. Now he was never vicious, even though he was considered wild by Victorian society and even branded as the Mad Marquis. His name legend survives today mainly in the form of plays and references in various forms of media, but his legend still holds a bit of the original creep factor that it had when it first bubbled out of the public consciousness. Reports of his wraith would become Spring Hill Jack first appeared in 1837 as described in historian Mike Dash's exhaustive history of the figure's reported appearance. Residents of a London neighborhood began to report bizarre attacks, really more like harassments from a ghost, imp, or devil in the shape of a large white bull, mainly attacking women. The monster would ring doorbells. When someone answered, it would ravage their clothes with its claws, and other sightings have him simply ambushing people who were just out walking. Similar reports continued to trickle in throughout the rest of the year, with strange crimes being attributed to assailants in the guise of a ghost, a bear, or a devil. These disparate reports would eventually lead to the theory that this mysterious monster might have been a group of well-to-do men dressing up and scaring people on a bet. And many reports that the figure was wearing red shoes or armor. After the attacks and attention given to Spring Hill Jack in 1838, the figure became a popular boogeyman across England. He became a character in a number of cheap penny dreadfuls, many titled Spring Hill Jack, the Terror of London, where he was alternately portrayed as everything from a jilted brigand to a supernatural menace. And all of these depictions just served to cement his boogeyman status. Parents would tell stories of the jumping devil to scare their kids into submission. Mysterious unsolved crimes would be attributed to Jack by sensationalist reporters looking to sell newspapers. And this elusive monster now belonged to Victorian nightmares. Eyewitness reports of Spring Hill Jack continued popping up all over the country, if less frequently and from much less substantial sources as the spate of occurrences in 1837, 1838. Copycat attackers were captured here and there, trying to take advantage of the legend. The mischievous devil made a series of appearances at the Aldershot military base, where he harassed and terrified sentry guards in 1877. And then, in 1904, Jack made what is considered his last confirmed appearance in Liverpool, where he was witnessed leaping up and down the street before jumping onto the rooftops and bounding away forever. But even if official sightings of Spring Hill Jack had stopped, his legend still survives. Characters inspired by Spring Hill Jack can be found from steampunk novels to mainstream comic books. The conspicuously Victorian air of the gaunt, springing devil continues to evoke the era in which his legend grew, making him a popular template for scare stories. Although today we might remember his name for better or worse, Spring Hill Jack may never inspire the kind of terror that he once did. Before Jack the Ripper terrorized London, Spring Hill Jack was tormenting citizens with his claws and his tight-fitting clothes. Jack began this year in Everton, perched atop St. Francis Xavier's Church, but after hijinks on Salisbury Street, it seemed that he ventured back to his old stomping ground. And by now, London was in the grip of a new terror. A mysterious killer was butchering women in the East End of London. A letter signed Spring Hill Jack, the Whitechapel murderers, claimed responsibility for the infamous Ripper murders. Spring Hill Jack's antics were deemed too trivial to be the real Ripper. But the name Jack stuck to these appalling murders. That we know of, Jack the Ripper stopped killing at 5, but the atrocities of the autumn in Whitechapel were certainly befitting of a devil. In Victorian England, the scariest boogeyman was a fire-breathing devil man who could jump unnaturally high. And some said he was a demon, while others thought he was just an extraordinarily agile human. But no matter what you believed about the legend, Spring Hill Jack was a name that inspired fear among the folk. No one ever really figured out for sure who or what Spring Hill Jack was. Some thinking that he might have been a rich guy playing tricks on people, using some fancy gear to jump so high. And others thought maybe he was just a made-up story that got out of hand because people like to talk about spooky things. But even though we don't know if he was real or not, Spring Hill Jack has become part of English history. And his story shows us that sometimes we like to be a bit scared and that we're all really curious about stuff that doesn't have any easy explanation. No one was really afraid of running into him in a dark alley. The story of Spring Hill Jack is still around. It's a cool old tale that reminds us that there will always be mysteries and legends that stick around, even long after the scary part is gone. It's like Spring Hill Jack jumped right out of the foggy streets of London and into the books where we keep our favorite myths and legends. Alright guys, what do you guys think about Spring Hill Jack? Go and do your own research. Read about Spring Hill Jack of London. I think maybe it was some kind of antics happening, and then of course we all turn it into a big old urban legend, and we go more and more with it so it can go into those newspapers and sell, you know? So what do you guys think? I think this was pretty neat. Spring Hill Jack. Hope to see you guys next time, guys, on Tales Told in the Dark. Thank you, guys.